Hi, I'm Regan Robinson, your host of Future Fit, the only podcast unraveling the secrets of how the world's most innovative leaders stay future ready in a fast-paced world. I've spent over 20 years as a futurist and strategist, transforming top global brands and putting investment-backed startups on paths to sustainable growth. Along the way, I've become obsessed with new ways to prepare for the future, because thinking about the long term once a year simply isn't enough. In each episode, I talk with movers, shakers, and path breakers who share their stories about how they turn uncertainty into their strategic advantage. Throughout our journey, we'll discover unconventional and imaginative ways to help you thrive today while leading your teams into tomorrow. Future Fit leaders know that being prepared for what's next is more than a business decision. It's a way of being. Let's venture together as we co-create a new future readiness playbook. The future can't wait, and neither can I. So, are you ready to get future fit? Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Lesley Pinckney, an accomplished marketing and digital transformation expert with a track record of building successful brands and businesses, and whose aim is to make the world a better place through technology. Lesley is renowned for her expertise in driving innovation and focusing on youth and diverse audiences, and is the head of marketing for Incubation and Disruptive Innovation at Intel, a Fortune 100 company with over $52 billion in revenues in 2023. Lesley oversees marketing and communications for the IDI Business Group, which combines vision technology and AI to develop vertically integrated solutions across categories like robotics, finance, healthcare, and retail. Lesley has also built a successful speaking career, making appearances at conferences including South by Southwest, Blog Her, the Media Post Summit, and many more. She's also served on several nonprofit boards focused on improving outcomes for youth, and currently sits on the board of directors for Near North Montessori School in Chicago. Lesley is someone who is at the forefront of designing future-ready brands, and so I am incredibly excited to hear what she has to share with us today. So welcome to the show, Lesley.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Thrilled to have you as well. So let's dive into our conversation with something I ask all of my guests, which is, what does future ready mean to you?
Okay, so what does future ready mean to me? For me, I think being in technology and in the digital landscape long enough to recognize that you don't really know what's coming next, to me, the biggest way to be future ready is to be resilient and capable of change, because that is the only thing that we can guarantee, is that the future, while we can predict some of the things, there will always be things that we can't predict that will come out of left field. And so what I like to do is I like to understand the macro trends, see what's bubbling up under the surface, but I also think being able to be fluid in your thinking and resilient in your approach or your strategy is probably even more important than understanding the trends, because I can tell you stories of how we all thought the internet was going to go, or how we all thought email was going to go, or how we all thought social media was going to go. And I think the roads are littered with prognosticators who thought they knew what was coming, and that didn't turn out to be the case. And so being future ready, it's about a mindset. It's about being prepared for the unthinkable. It's not necessarily about being first or the one with the idea, because Apple, who's probably been a fast follower, we often talk about as a future-proof brand. And they arguably really should be known as a fast follower and not the innovator that we think about them as. Right. And so I think it really is about that secret sauce of being able to understand the trend and where it's going, but also having the strength and conviction to challenge every step of the way, to really allow for to be poised for being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh, you hit on so many amazing points. One of the things that came up for me is I always remind people the future is a place where anything can be different, even things that seem impossible to change today, right?
Absolutely.
And so this idea,
Absolutely.
you're,
I watch a lot of TV. It's
me
probably,
too.
and so
You ever want to nerd out on documentaries? I'm your girl.
right. Well, my wife was recently rewatching The West Wing, and I watched it when it first came out.
Hmm.
And just I would walk by and just hear clips of it. And what's so interesting is that the show has been out for over 20 years.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so much of the conversation and so many of the issues that President Bartlett was fighting against, we're still fighting against now. And I think
Right,
that part of what we're seeing right now in really a lot of sectors is this box that we've put ourselves in, to your point about the future is going to look somewhat like today. And that requires a whole amount of assumptions that lead to faulty thinking because the future doesn't have to look anything like today.
no,
And the minute we start to think about a future with structures and entities of today in place is the minute we're preventing ourselves from truly thinking about what the future could be.
absolutely.
Um, and so for me, it is finding those times where you can suspend what you already know, and that's really hard.
Yeah,
You know,
it is. It
it's
is.
really hard, especially when there's money and jobs and livelihoods on the line today to really allow yourself to think free of those current entrapments is really, really hard, which is why the three box thing that they tell you at Harvard is important because of if you really want to innovate, you need people and groups that are insulated from the current business because it's almost impossible to future
Right.
proof a business when you're also
100%.
thinking about what the shareholders are going to think this quarter or next quarter or what your annual returns are. And you can see it in any organization. I see it in our school board. We want people who don't have kids in the school because it's really hard when you're a parent to think about what school should be in 50 years when you're just worried about your kid getting into the right selective high school or the right college. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
this idea of like, how do you think freely is something I spend a lot of time trying to recreate, trying to force, trying to push myself to do,
Hmm.
because that when you come into it with any preconceived notions, you're limiting what the opportunities can be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's first of all, it's what you were talking about previously is about the importance of outside in thinking. One of the biggest mistakes I see leaders make all the time is narrowcasting and focusing on the familiar. And the other thing that comes up for me is not singular, it's futures. And so a lot of the work that I do is helping leaders and companies anticipate all the possibilities because to your point, things are going to come, things are going to change. In fact, my personal POV is that technology is actually what's trendy. And things like human mindsets is actually what's more enduring. Human mindsets, need states, Maslow hierarchy
Hierarchy
of
states.
needs, like those are actually universal and elemental over time. And so we'll get into how you classify trends, but I'd love to dig in a little bit further. So you quote Eleanor Roosevelt in your email signature, and it's one of her many brilliant proclamations, which is do one thing every day that scares you. And I love that because it emphasizes the importance of stepping outside your comfort zone. So I think this is germane to what we were talking about around resilience. And this mindset is really crucial for staying adaptable and innovative in a rapidly changing world. So do one thing every day that scares you can actually be a really powerful approach to preparing for the future. So what are some ways that you get outside your comfort zone and get your mind ready for future oriented and imaginative thinking?
I think for me, I am a information and culture junkie. And so I consume more content than most people I know across all different channels and platforms. So
Again,
that
we have
for
to nerd
me,
out on this because you may have met your match.
yeah. So I'm embarrassed to tell you how many Reddit bananas I had last year, but for me, I think that's usually my jumping off point is starting with the consumption of content. And right now I'm reading a collection of short stories about semi-modern Native American culture in Oakland.
Mm,
I'm not Native American. I'm not from Oakland. I don't normally read short stories, but
mm,
Margaret Atwood, who I love, said that this book is something everyone should read. So I'm reading it. And the amount, as someone who really understands the plight of Black Americans and has an incredible sense of our history and our contributions, coming into this conversation into the Native American culture just really showcased for me some of the consistencies of the human condition, also connected the dots on
the
like
patterns.
what the patterns are, what systems of oppression look like, and
Mm,
also made me in some ways question the privilege that I do have in
mm,
light of some of the stories that I'm reading. And here is something that has absolutely nothing to do with my job or nothing to do with my day-to-day livelihood, but is forcing me to reevaluate long-held truths that I believe in. And
ah,
so for me, that's usually where it starts, is that curiosity of the other and
yeah,
wanting to spend and not just being content with understanding what is immediately important and tangible to me. And so that's
yeah,
always been how my brain works in terms of I've been obsessed with Chinese history for forever. And it doesn't really impact my day to day, but the ability to see and connect the dots and understand the repetitive nature of things, I think is important. If you know anything about Joseph Campbell and the arc of the hero, and that you can see that same story arc repeated all throughout history. And so while I wouldn't say that I believe everything is preordained or destined, I do think that there are cosmic cycles or universal
absolutely.
truths
Yeah,
that impact every aspect. And so figuring out how to learn more about the human condition, to me, has always been a launch pad for learning more about what kind of resiliency you need to be ready for the future, right?
yeah,
Because in history, you can see there's different times need different people. And we needed Martin Luther King, and we also needed Malcolm X. And so understanding these things, you can pull that same analogy in your business. Sometimes you
absolutely.
need the Malcolm, sometimes you need the Martin. And so to me, it's like connecting those cosmic and dots so that things don't surprise me. I
Yeah,
might be, oh wow, okay, I didn't expect that, to being full blown surprised.
you're
Um,
not. Well,
not
well, what you're saying, there's actually a lot of science behind what you're saying. So we know in terms through cognitive science and neuroscience in terms of how the brain works from a pattern recognition standpoint, what you're experiencing, there's a reason why you're not surprised, is because you're exposing yourself to information and then your brain is cataloging it. And so that is why bumping up against the other, whatever that is for you, I love that articulation because that is something I do on the daily and I always encourage people to do. Because so I was joking, I'm the only futurist, or I can't say I'm the only, but I am one of the few futurists who's actually a historical nonfiction nerd because I actually look to history because those patterns are repeated. So, for example, when Gutenberg and the printing press, which changed the communications infrastructure in a significant way, a lot of the things that were happening culturally and from a societal perspective around distrust, and it's very germane to what's happening right now around AI and bots and things like that. And so if you look and study that period, how did people respond? Then you can
right.
actually equip yourself to better anticipate and respond to actually what is happening now. There's magic in history. There are secrets in history.
Absolutely.
And I think the other thing that you said, really immersing yourself in cultures other than your own, whether through travel, literature, food. I know you're into soul food cooking, but when you expose yourself to different ways of life, that actually dramatically widens your thinking patterns and can stimulate your brain to actually think in unconventional ways to help you effectively anticipate the future. And so what I think is important for our audience to understand also is the act of you just reading a series of short stories. Not only did you get new knowledge, but it is actually training your brain to be more future thinking and to be more adaptable and resilient. And I don't think people really realize that actually something as simple as that and exposing yourself to new information, your brain is kicking into pattern recognition. And so it's actually once you start to understand, wow, okay, I have to train my brain to see the world like this and think like this. And then once you do it, like how I operate on a daily basis, it becomes effortless.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think your point to travel is so important. I just think about how different our world would be if more Americans actually traveled. So I think the fact that there are large swaths of our population who feel like going to Las Vegas is the same thing as seeing the Eiffel Tower in person is a problem. And I think because of our unique role in modern history, it is, I think on the one hand, we have this can-do spirit that obviously has led to the incredible amount of success that America has had. There is a part of me that worries that we are losing our edge in some way, shape, or form because of the fact that we are becoming in some ways more insular.
Yeah. Again, it's that outside in. You need outside in, inside out in every context.
Correct. And so for me, it's definitely fascinating to see this happening on a macro level and a micro level. I as someone that has a young child, I have to choose to see the positive in the world every day.
I think that's a good segue into my next question. So speaking of the macro and speaking of trends, so I often find that leaders, what you were saying, I often find that leaders misunderstand trends and people have their own interpretations about how to use them to get meaningful, actionable insights. And you're obviously someone who keeps your finger on the pulse of what's next in tech and AI. You lead workshops on these subjects. So as someone who's playing a pivotal role in shaping the tech industry and driving innovation, having a robust approach to being ahead of the curve is essential. And so I'm curious, how do you define what trends are in your work? And what advice or guidance might you have for leaders who are struggling to use them in a meaningful way when preparing for the future?
So whenever I hear the word trend, I think of the popcorn reports from the past that used to do. Faith Popcorn, I think was her name. And she used to do the youth trend reports. And it was like, I think the scrunchie is going to be in this year. So I think that is one level of trend spotting. And I think for a long time in the industry, that was sufficient. But the pace with which culture moves today, that kind of trend spotting and trend hunting to me feels like an exercise in futility, right? Because from a consumer lens, the trend seems to be so fast that it's like you're literally just chasing your tail, right? And especially when I think of brands, we've had more fashion brands probably launch in like the last 5 years than we had in the 100 years before then. All these fashion brands that are going after one thing or a niche. And I just think that is an expensive game that really is predicated a lot on luck. And I think what really should be trends are more what you were saying on like the organization of people's hierarchy of needs, right? And more macro trends that you can credibly build a 2 to 5 year business plan around.
Right.
And so for me, this idea of like macro trends and understanding like the bigger human condition is more important, right?
Yeah.
I also think that customer pain points are a trend that never goes out of style.
Right.
And it's amazing to me how people will forego what they know to be true in pursuit of something that they think to be true. And customer pain points are something that every company has.
Right.
I will throw rental car companies under the bus. If you've ever rented a car in the last 6 months, you would be shocked that it's not 1975.
Oh yeah, I
Like,
rent one twice a month when I go horseback riding. So
exactly. And you and I sitting here could probably come up with a million ways that we could make car rental, the process, less onerous, less
right.
frustrating. But you know what? Instead, we got Uber, we got Lyft, we got what's the one where you can Turo, we got all of these other
Height is another one.
experiences
Yeah.
that, yes, are disrupting the car rental business, but yet if Hertz or Avis had invested in making the process for renting a car as simple as it is to book an Uber, that would be game over, category winning.
Right.
Everyone from there, it would be game over,
Yeah,
And
considering
so,
the existing assets that they're starting with, right?
exactly.
The market
And
they have.
so the trend, so like here are Avis and Hertz being like, oh, the trend are EVs. Let's jump after that. And it's like, no, 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 no. The trend is ease of use and convenience. That's actually the trend. And
Right.
you're going after the stated trend, which is everybody wants to drive an EV. But the actual trend is people renting cars, whether on business or vacation, ease of use and convenience are at the top of their list. And
Mhm.
so for me, I look at the trend. I always try to see what's the underlying sort of mind state that's driving that trend. Think about all the predictions about what was going to happen during the pandemic. People will never go out to eat again at home meal. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. That's
Right.
not going to
Right.
happen. Quarantining is not going to be a thing in the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
It might be if we have another pandemic, but I think there's so much. I mean, trends are the modern day broader version of clickbait. But
Yeah.
I think
That's
there's like
interesting.
this thing of
Yeah.
if I make it a trend, it's like people will talk about it. But
Yeah.
in actuality, all good ideas really live in that I'm solving a problem that people either didn't know they need to be solved or that no one
Mhm.
solved as well before. And so if you want to call those things trends, then so be it. But I like to think of it as more a novel approach on an old idea, or you
Right.
bring differentiated thinking to solving an age-old problem,
Totally. Totally. One is that what you're saying is for leaders to use what's happening in the world in a meaningful way. The starting point is always look to your customers. What is the job to be done? And start there. If you don't know where else to start and you don't know how to use them in maybe some more sophisticated things that are happening, start with the customer. And I think I always avoid the word trends in my work. I use forces and signals, right?
Right.
Because I think because people, they have misunderstandings around the scope, scale, and pace of trends. And so if you recognize these misunderstandings, you can more accurately interpret them and set realistic expectations around their movement and impact. And so
Yeah.
that's why I use signals, because emerging signals, yes, those are the seeds of opportunity. Now, whether or not a scrunchie is an emerging signal or not completely depends on the context, right? But that could be for a particular business in a particular category at a particular time. That's why you have to, if you are able to look beyond the customer, really understanding the difference of, okay, what's more of a macro force, this more of enduring fundamental human aspect, where mindset's changing versus what could be an emerging signal, which is a concrete manifestation of the future and the present.
Correct. Correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that you see it everywhere. AI is probably the latest trend, and everyone's like racing to make themselves AI relevant or AI friendly or be able to say AI in their earnings reports. But the reality is that it's a tool, it's not a trend.
Right.
And the trend is or the signal is really automation, which is being fed by a higher issue, which is that corporate America is run amok and doesn't necessarily, like, labor challenges are pervasive. And
Mm-hmm.
if companies don't have to rely on people, there are a lot of financial resources to be gained from that. No
Totally.
downtime, no learning curves, no HR issues, all of that. And so for you to be a business that's just jumping on this like buzzword AI without understanding that this is a tool that is really addressing these larger
Yeah.
issues, like you're not going to get the trend right
Yeah.
because you don't understand what's driving this trend, or to your point, signal, or however you want to, however you want to label it, you're not going to know. And you also can make a misstep in that calculation, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
anybody that's done any automation projects know it is a very fine line between what can truly be automated and where you need the human interaction, and also navigating that from a morale, a public perception perspective. You can't just fire everybody tomorrow and say, hey, we're replacing people with robots or whatever the case may be. And so it's a bigger conversation always than the trend allows for. And I
Yeah.
think too many leaders get caught up in the trend, and when are lurching versus strategically planning, here's what's really impacting my business, or here's the
Yeah.
real pressure that's on my business,
Yeah,
you
here
know?
are the implications. And to your point, what's underneath it? The metaphor that I'll share is think of a trend as like an iceberg, right? And so what's above the water, everybody can see, right? It's obvious. And but
Yeah.
then what's more important is what is underneath it and all the stuff that is swirling around it. You have to dive in and really start to unpack that in order, to your point, to really harness these insights in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think leadership in general, my experience has been they're some of the worst offenders of, like, because I believe it to be true, I think it's true. Like, I did
Yeah.
some time in the sponsorship world, and it was amazing how many sponsorship decisions just came down to, oh, the CEO likes to play golf.
Yeah. Well, that's where confirmation bias is coming in, right?
Exactly,
And so,
exactly. And so I think it's harder for certain leaders, especially in legacy businesses, to get
yeah.
out of the comfort zone
Mm-hmm.
and trust the data, right? Because, or trust the information, because maybe it's not always about
Right.
trusting the data, it's about
Right. It could
trusting.
be intuition or other forms of knowledge. It could also
Right,
be a part of the equation.
right. But I think that to me is really interesting, because I worked when I worked at Time Inc.
Mm-hmm.
When I was working for Essence magazine. It
Mm-hmm.
was a really interesting time to be there because the internet had just started to, like, really come into its own. And I remember, like, Google coming to Essence and saying, we will digitize the whole archive and we'll do this rev share. And I remember having conversations with other executives at Time Inc., and there was a sense that the magazine business was always going to be the way that it was then.
Right.
And I was like, if
That's
you think,
recency bias.
right, I
Coming.
was like, if you think this is just a cyclical magazine downturn, like, I have a
Yeah.
bridge to tell you.
Yeah.
Because it was like everything, but again, it was like so many people could not imagine a world where every household did not buy Time magazine. And I was like, but you don't understand. I'm going to get Time magazine in this. And it's going to be a completely different scenario. And whenever I feel like I know something, I always go back to that moment, because I remember thinking to myself in the moment, oh my goodness, like the media brands that I grew up with are slowly on their way to irrelevancy. If
Right.
someone would have told me at 10 that Sports Illustrated, Time, and People were not going to be the biggest media brands in my life, I would have said they're crazy. But, like, Time went to CNN and Sports Illustrated went to ESPN
Right.
because they didn't diversify and they thought TV was not where they needed to play. And so you can always look back, which is important. Like, everyone is now saying AI is going to change everything. Microsoft Word didn't really change a lot.
There's another tool to your point earlier.
Other tool, right.
Y-
So this changes. I think that there's room for everything, but it will change, right? Because the same way that like the internet didn't really replace magazines, magazines didn't radio, TV didn't really replace radio. They all found their way, and so that's part of it. Is although I would argue that magazines maybe haven't found their way, but I think you can. But I think it's about recognizing all of that, and I was always struck by like this unwillingness to look into other industries for innovation.
Well,
And
innovation
so,
can come from anywhere, right?
yeah, yeah,
Well, and I think it's important for people to understand that data shows that once a business runs up against a major stall in its growth, it only has a 10% chance of ever fully recovering. So,
that's an interesting stat.
yeah, and I can send
Yeah.
you the reference for that.
I'd love to
I've
see
got a
that.
lot, I've got a lot of those, and people are like,
That's a
"What?"
good one. Huh.
Because I'm trying to build the case for what I do as a futurist, which is called strategic foresight. That's the discipline, and it's all around anticipating multiple futures on a continuous way, because there is no one future. And the future, aka today, really requires that you're constantly getting outside your comfort zone, like a lot of the things that we've talked about today, in order to maintain that growth trajectory. And so you can make money off a declining business model forever, right? But again, once you hit that stall in its growth, good luck.
Yeah. I think you raise a really interesting point, because I don't see a lot of parallel pathing future proofing plans. I think you're onto something, because I think usually what it is, it's like a plan B, if that. It's like, here's our plan, here's what we're striving for, but if that doesn't work out, here's what else we can do. Very rarely have I been privy, like in my agency days where you saw a little bit more of what was going on. I have not been privy to very many companies that are like, have more of a direction flow strategic plan. There's multiple outcomes and there's multiple ways forward. It's usually, this is the way forward, and if this one obvious thing that we think might happen happens, here's plan B. Very rarely do I see, here are 4 ways that we can be going down this path, and if this happens, then we can pivot to here. But no, if this happens, here's what that looks like. And my guess is that, unfortunately, that feels like something where other folks would be like, well, that's a lot of work. And we're sure that feels a bias trap almost, because why do we need to plan for these other options? We feel like we know pretty much this is going to be the way that this goes down. And so that's really interesting. I'm going to think about that and see if I can.
Well, we can talk more, because that is exactly what I do, but there's a way that you do it that is more modular, but also where you're almost switching out components. And that's why I advocate for this way of thinking and seeing and working.
Yeah.
If you get it to a point where it's effortless and you've created psychological safety and a lot of the important things that need to happen internally within a culture, so that the team is all singing from the same songbook, you can iterate pretty quickly, and you can actually evolve and harness an adaptable strategy that moves the way that markets move. There are companies that do it successfully, but it is certainly the drum that I beat on a continuous basis around. Hey, like, it's also, keep in mind, it's like at a mindset level. So I always use language like, we're going to sketch, or we're going to illustrate, or we're going to paint. Let's put together a couple of pictures, and we can do that in a lot of different ways. So yeah, you're not building down to your tactical plan. So there are definitely ways to overcome, but it is hard work. But my belief is, and data is proving this out in terms of, for example, companies that have dedicated foresight, which is what I do, methodology and resources, achieve a 200% higher growth rate, and are 33%, I think that is the stat, more profitable than companies that don't, because they are building this engine. Much you're probably facilitating innovation engines within Intel. Same goes with foresight.
Interesting. Yeah, I would love to learn more about that. I think it's really important. I think especially because in the startup world, oftentimes you're forced in that. And so I've been lucky in my career. I've worked at startups, I've worked in legacy companies, worked for startups inside of legacy companies, and I think they all have their pluses and minuses. I think in the legacy companies, it's hard to push yourself because there's so much like specialization and infrastructure that it's like I'm doing this thing,
Right.
whereas in a startup, I'm doing all the things, and that ability to think differently is much easier, I think, to achieve and permeate because you're doing something that's never been done. I think for me, the biggest challenge is in those legacy environments where this is how we've always done it. And those sorts of scenarios, it's hard to overcome the groupthink of,
Right.
hey, this is how it's always been done. But you have to, because as we all see, legacy businesses can turn on a dime. So,
Right. Or it's actually right in front of us, and it's just been happening in a slow decline, right? And this
yeah,
is where
yeah.
it's so simple things like asking what if questions, questioning existing processes. We've talked about this a lot more, outside in versus inside out.
Yeah.
Rewarding curiosity, rewarding, actually, not just recognizing it, rewarding it.
And also trying different things. I think there's so much aversion to, oh, well, we don't know if it's going to work. You're never going to know. So
Right.
unless you try it. And that's what we pride ourselves on, is like getting to market quickly and getting that customer feedback, because
Yeah,
I stand by my original point, which is the one thing I know about the future is that customers are going to have a lot of sway. And if I can
absolutely.
align my objectives and my business around customer needs and customer want, that's a pretty safe bet. And how we get
Yeah.
there and how we engage our customers allows for a huge blank canvas of innovation and opportunity. But that underlying central premise of like success is through your customer, to me, feels like the first building block in future proofing your organization. And then it's, okay, how am I bringing in what I'm learning from science, what I'm learning from biology, what I'm learning from psychology, what I'm learning from pop culture, what I'm learning from filmmaking, what I'm learning from storytelling, and bringing all of that together, because innovations in different industries can make you think about your own industry different and what that could potentially bring to bear. And it's not just important for you to be an expert in your channel or your field or your category. It's important to look at other categories. Like, I'm fascinated with what's going on in medicine today.
Yeah.
The way that they're thinking about tackling some of these diseases, the
Mhm.
pharmaceutical approach. There's all sorts of learnings there that can be taken to technology, to business process, to HR,
Yeah.
so
Well,
it's
fun
exciting.
fact, I was leading my mom's cancer battle many years ago, and I actually reapplied a lot of even the spreadsheets that I used when I was in the agency world and and leading strategy and doing client management. I actually reconfigured and applied to how I led my mom's cancer battle. So again, I think one of the big takeaways from
Absolutely.
our conversation today is that taking things that work in one industry or context and reimagining them or reapplying them in another is a really powerful way to be future ready. Innovations that are happening over here and being the first or one of the first to bring them to your industry, there's a lot of magic in that. And there's actually less risk, right? Because it's not like you're building something that is like truly original, right? It's
Right.
like innovation can be introduction in this new context. And so I think that's
Correct.
really important for people. So before I bring our conversation to a close, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think, one, thank you so much for having me. And I really love this topic and love being a part of the conversation. I think there's room for improvement everywhere, from the school board that I sit on all the way up to the companies that I work for. And the one thing I would just say to your audience is that sometimes we've all had those managers that are like haters and dream crushers. And if you want to practice this, you don't necessarily always have to practice this sort of orientation in a professional setting.
Yeah.
You can bring it to how you parent. You can bring it to how you cook. You can bring it to how you look for a house or real estate or how you approach your vacations. Like, it isn't just something that you can only practice professionally.
Yeah.
The world would be a better place if we were practicing this sort of future readiness across all areas of our life. And so that would be my one sort of parting word, is that if you can do it at work, great, but that's not the only place you can do this sort of thinking, and you should be doing it everywhere you can across your whole life.
That's brilliant, and welcome to my world. I always say future readiness is a state of being. Like,
Yes.
it is embodied, and it is the embodiment of me in every capacity. And I love how you beautifully articulated it. You can also experiment and play in your personal life. And there are things that then because it is a muscle. That's why the show's called, there's no secret why the show's called Future Fit, or maybe it's a secret because I'm trying to draw a corollary between fitness,
Yes.
right? Just like our future fitness saying goes. And so the more you practice it, just the more you go to the gym, well, it tends to get a little easier until you're willing to push yourself outside your comfort zone. So final question before you share where listeners can find out more about you. So in your view, is preparing for the future more about managing risks or capitalizing on opportunities?
Capitalizing on opportunities, of course.
Like, Regan.
I've never been someone who plays defense. Like, I'm much more of a let's go out and rally the troops. So I think maximizing opportunities. I think the risk part is important because you don't want to be reckless.
Right.
And minimizing risk is important, but I think maximizing the opportunities is my world orientation. And I think the more comfortable for me path towards being future ready.
Marvelous. And with that, where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
So the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. I'm not great on the gram, but I am pretty active on LinkedIn. I actually am not going to share my username on Reddit, but you can probably track me down or find me there. I spend a lot of time on Reddit. It's my cultural on-ramp to things I know nothing about. And then you can also follow me, Lesley Pinckney, on Spotify. I have a ton of playlists. Music is my passion.
Oh, cool.
And you can future ready yourself musically by checking out some of my playlists. So
love that. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time and your brilliant insights, Lesley. It's been so much fun and enlightening, and I have just learned so much from this conversation, and I feel like we are two birds of a feather. And so I am looking forward to continuing to chat together.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back anytime. And it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Future Fit. If you're listening, you're probably future curious. So follow me in my newsletter on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going and share your discoveries with the Future Fit community. And if you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe, rate, and review Future Fit on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time.